Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of this course. As a reminder, I want to see proposals for your first paper by the end of this week, then want to see your actual first paper by the end of next week. I'll want that paper to be posted to a Turnitin link that I will put at the top of our courses Vanco Hall page uh, this week. So let me know if you have any questions about the paper, and I'm happy to go over them with you. So this week we've got an assortment of readings that are all posted on Vanco Hall. We won't be using the textbook. So our topic is American imperialism. Last week I alluded to this idea, and I I did it within the context of the idea of American exceptionalism, which is an idea that has been around since our founding as a country, that the United States of America isn't like other countries, that because of our Constitution and democratic nature, we are motivated by ideals rather than the raw pursuit of power. This week's readings certainly offer an exception to that idea of exceptionalism, but I want to be clear as we're talking about this period that, like with the egregious excesses of the Indian Wars, many Americans were opposed to their country becoming an imperialist power. Many Americans did things about their country becoming an imperialist power. They held fast to those truths alluded to in our Declaration of Independence, the title of your textbook for this year. They um, our better angels have always spoken out against the abuses of our baser devils. And that doesn't change the fact that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives during these imperialist adventures, and entire countries were destroyed at the behest of American business interests. There are regions of the world that remain unstable to this day, whose instability can be traced to the period we're covering in class today. So our better angels, as much as I might laud them, have a responsibility to the victims of our country's past and present. So let's start with some background. Where can I put myself here? I don't want to cover Africa. Uh, Here, I'll just get out of the frame. All right, so in 1884, an upstart new country, Germany, decided it was time to organize the European imperialism that had been exploding over the previous decades, especially in Africa. Otto von Bismarck called together the Berlin Conference to essentially divide up Africa and decide who would get to lay claim to what. The United States sent delegates to this conference, though they were observers, not participants. Americans left proud that they had defended the territorial integrity of the colony founded by the American Colonization Society for Free African Americans, Liberia. So, this little country right here. Um, though the majority of the people in Liberia were always Africans, not African Americans. So Abyssinia was the only other country to successfully resist imperialism over here. They beat back the Italians by force of arms, though lost to them when the Italians attacked with internationally outlawed poison gas again in 1935. But the underlying explicit assumption of those in attendance at the Berlin Conference was that they were more powerful culturally and racially superior, therefore they could take over the rest of the world. And they had, as Rudyard Kipling would later argue, as he encouraged Americans to become imperialists, a white man's burden to uplift the supposedly lesser races of the world. That uplift would include horrific exploitation with much less substantive cultural value. So, an early example of American imperialism, switch to it, outside the continent of, outside the continent, oh, where can I put myself? I'll put myself over here by the doles, pineapples. So, uh, an early example of American imperialism outside the continental U.S. was in Hawaii. This isn't the first example. In the mid 19th century, so called Southern filibusters attempted to take over places like Cuba and Nicaragua, but they had little governmental or financial support for their irresponsible and criminal ventures. But the annexation of Hawaii was different and would foreshadow U.S. interventions into many parts of Latin America in the early 20th century. So in 1874, American and British planters living in the independent kingdom of Hawaii convinced their respective countries to occupy the kingdom when elections were contested. A key figure in encouraging this to happen was Samuel Dole, who pioneered the cultivation of pineapple in the islands, after whom the Dole Fruit Company is named. The fact that they could call on troops gave them immense leverage, and in 1887, they were able to implement property requirements for voting, which essentially gave these plantation owners disproportionate power in Hawaiian politics. They went further and overthrew the last queen of Hawaii in a coup in 1894, and only 4 years later, while the Spanish American War was ongoing, they convinced Congress to annex Hawaii as a territory to the United States. Native Hawaiians were, of course, not consulted in this decision. Oh, here we go. The Spanish American War, then, on its surface, this is another conflict now, is less explicitly imperialist than the Hawaiian grab. So before 1898, the U.S. press had for years been following news of the Cubans uprising against the Spanish. The Spanish were using brutal counterinsurgency tactics that included rounding up rural people and putting them into concentration camps so they wouldn't be able to support rebels. Thousands starved to death through their brutal indifference. There was deep sympathy for Cubans among the American public, just as there had been decades worth of people seeking to annex Cuba to the United States. In 1898, the U.S. sent a warship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to monitor the safety of Americans in Cuba. In January of that year, the ship exploded in port. 266 sailors on board eventually died from the explosion, and the so-called yellow presses, named for the hue of their paper but implied to be more of propaganda than news value, also exploded in fury over the explosion of the Maine. They blamed Spain for the explosion, either through an act of sabotage or perhaps from a torpedo. It was later discovered that a faulty boiler on board was responsible for the explosion. So, the U.S. nevertheless declared war in April, and by August, the Spanish were defeated in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The U.S. would then annex the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam at the end of the war. Cuba remained occupied ostensibly to protect the new government there, but also to protect the interests of the American United Sugar Company. So anyone in Cuba today will typically be able to tell you about the infamous Platt Amendment passed in 1901 that essentially gave the U.S. the right to militarily intervene whenever necessary to preserve the integrity of the Cuban government. The reality was that any time Cuban governmental policy threatened U.S. business interests, American forces would invade. Over the next few decades, the precedent of the Platt Amendment was used to justify dozens of interventions, usually by U.S. Marines, all over Latin America and the Caribbean. You've got a great quote by a Marine veteran of these campaigns, Smedley Butler, in your readings for this week. He calls himself a gangster for capitalism and muses that he could probably teach Al Capone a few tricks. Where do I put myself here? Okay, so oh, there we go. While the U.S. was laying the framework for justifying interventions into Latin America, American forces also had become embroiled in a hardly reported on conflict in the Philippines. After Philippine forces cooperated with the Americans to beat the Spanish, they expected the Americans to then start making plans to leave. But the Philippines seemed like too important of a possession to just give up. It would provide an excellent base for coaling ships plying the Pacific trade, and its resources, it seemed, could help the U.S.'s burgeoning industries. So the resistance, led by America's erstwhile ally, Emiliano Aguinaldo, was put down with the same kind of brutal force that the Spanish had been using in Cuba. Once news of these atrocities began to trickle out, the irony wasn't lost on plenty of Americans. American forces forcibly removed villagers to concentration camps in their Philippine campaign. They used water torture to gain information and frequently killed civilians. Roughly 200,000 Filipinos died in this conflict. In 1902, one Army officer, Jacob Hurd, was court-martialed for his policies on the island of Samar the year before. As he was conducting a campaign marching across the island, he had his forces kill all males over the age of 10. In March 1902, this was published, and this was in retaliation for their attacks on. This was in retaliation for guerrilla attacks on his forces, so he blamed all males over 10 years old. So in March 1902, this was publicized in U.S. media, and the American public was outraged, demanding his court martial, which did happen. Um, the war was then officially ended that year, though uprisings continued for more than a decade after that. You've got a picture of people carrying out his order that was published in the Evening Journal, and this picture appeared across the U.S. Media. So the one of the reasons that stories like this didn't make it out much, though, was that the army had tight control over media coming out of the Philippines, but information about atrocities still leaked out. You've got a great discussion of how this happened and why this happened in your reading for this week. So while this zeal for imperialism was strong under the McKinley administration, um, the U.S. naturally got involved in yet another imperialist venture, this time in China. The Boxer Rebellion was a turn of the century uprising against foreign control over China. The Boxers, as they were called by outsiders because of their fondness for martial arts, which Americans at the time called Chinese boxing, um, called themselves various names. One that stuck for a while was the Militia United in Righteousness. They were a group of largely young men who objected to concessions given to foreigners in China. So they targeted foreign businesses and Christian churches, which they perceived as foreign, despite a long history of Chinese Christians going back to the period of antiquity. In fairness, the Christians they targeted were largely converts to recent European and American proselytizing. But the roots of the Boxers' discontent went all the way back to the Opium Wars and the incredibly bloody Taiping Rebellion that I talked about a couple weeks ago as one of the drivers of Chinese immigration to the United States. But they were really bothered by foreign control over Chinese ports, especially in the north of the country where the rebellion started. So French, German, Japanese, British, Russian, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, and American forces put down this rebellion. In 1901, they then forced the Chinese government to pay reparations for the rebellion. The US, for their part, used their portion of the money to build the American University in Beijing, in large part because many Americans objected to profiting off of Chinese misery. And again, I want to just point this out because you've got naked imperialist impulses among many Americans, but an absolute rejection of it among so many others. So in this propaganda poster from the period, you see the kind of racist propaganda that justified the intervention, while at the same time barring Chinese people who had become refugees from this conflict from settling in the United States. So in this same period, one of the more horrific and ignored examples of American imperialism occurred in Haiti. In 1915, when the American press was focused on how horrible the Germans were to the Belgians and justifiably how horrible the Ottomans were to the Armenians, the US invasion of Haiti and its subsequent atrocities almost slipped under everyone's radar, at least the radar of white Americans. In 1901, the Platt Amendment to intervene in Cuba set a nasty precedent that came to fruition in Haiti. The U.S. steadily increased its involvement there until invading in 1915 as a response to electoral unrest. U.S. Marines then hoisted an unpopular president onto the Haitians, then remained there for another 19 years to maintain a puppet government that would carry out the interests of U.S. business. The occupying forces themselves were extremely brutal. They used torture to hunt down rebels. They abolished the Haitian university system, reasoning that black people didn't need higher level thinking. They made the Haitians do forced labor for the occupying forces as well. A large number of the occupying troops were intentionally from the American South, as military authorities believed that their experience with Jim Crow policies made them better at controlling people of color. Jim Crow racism was itself a divide and conquer strategy for elites to divide poor whites from black people, who were also typically poor, with whom they naturally should have shared interests. In Haiti, where everyone was black, it was just brutal and only succeeded in unifying Haitians against the long American occupation. Yet the policies in Haiti and the American South inspired other brutal settler regimes in places like New Zealand and South Africa at this same time. So, one sector of American media, though, that shone a very bright light on the atrocities being committed in Haiti was the black press, which is a term referring to African American owned media companies. By 1915, when the Haitian invasion happened, the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing, and the activists of Harlem mobilized on behalf of other members of the African diaspora in Haiti. There were well-developed organizations of resistance by this time, including the NAACP, Marcus Garvey's Pan-African movement, and increasingly the Communist Party. To see Haiti succumb to imperialism, the Black Republic that had thrown off slavery, was particularly painful for so many people who had drawn such inspiration from Haiti. Some of the people listed on this slide, like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, James Weldon Johnson, used the mobilizations for Haiti to help structure the same global Pan-African movement whose conferences would eventually lay the groundwork for throwing off imperialism altogether all over the world. So it's not an exaggeration to say that without the activism of the heroes of the Harlem Renaissance, independent countries across Africa, countries that are experiencing massive economic growth right now as I speak, would have taken a lot longer to come into existence. Some people like Kwame Nkrumah, a hero of Ghanaian independence and its first president, he personally got his first exposure to Pan-African and anti-imperialist ideas in Harlem. So he was visiting there in the 1930s. So these same mobilizations would bring about the successes of the American Civil Rights Movement as well. And I really find the people of this period inspiring. They had courage, intelligence, amazing organizational skills, and they didn't give up, despite the fact that it would be decades before any of their efforts began to bear fruit, and many wouldn't live to see this happen at all. So we'll be, where would do I put myself right in the Standard Oil octopus here? I will. So we'll be talking about progressivism and labor activism, especially unions, in coming weeks, but I want to also emphasize the role that mobilizations against imperialism played in the progressive movement. The populist movement that we dealt with last week was, in my assessment, intellectually weak in comparison to the progressive movement, especially those strands of it which recognized oppression of women, racism, and imperialism as all tied to the power of unregulated capitalism. As we'll continue discussing in upcoming weeks, immigrant led organizations and black activists would make these connections clear. For so many white Americans, though, not only were the connections not clear, they were hardly reported on in the major presses of the day. So I want to deal with one other really egregious example of American imperialism. Try to switch slides here. Um, it occurred in what was called the Tampico affair. So the pretext of the attack is so outrageous that it's kind of hard to believe. So some U.S. sailors in 1914 were arrested for trespassing on the land of the Mexican telephone company near Tamaulipas in the north of the country. The captain of the ship demanded their release, demanded an apology, and demanded a 21-gun salute as a token of the Mexican apology for arresting sailors for something that's actually illegal to do. They were drunk, trespassing on Mexican land. So the Mexican authorities did return the sailors and even apologize, but they didn't give the 21-gun salute. So U.S. Marines used that as an excuse to invade Veracruz, which is hundreds of miles to the south in Mexico. The real reason for the invasion of Veracruz was that the Revolutionary Army occupying it, remember Mexico was in a civil war at the time, was threatening Standard Oil's control of oil there. So U.S. Marines attacked, occupied some government buildings, and made clear that any attempt to nationalize Mexican resources would be met with swift American military force. So it gets interventions in Mexico, though, get complicated. Well, that's a clear example of imperialism. Another is an example of intervention in Mexico is less so. Is a less clear example of imperialism. So in 1916, Pancho Villa, who supported Emilio Zapata against the U.S. supported Carranza government, remember, Civil War, began to carry out cross border raids into the U.S. In retaliation for American support. So in 1916, his forces killed 16 U.S. citizens in Columbus, New Mexico, and burned the town to the ground. So the U.S. launched a military operation into Mexico to find Pancho Villa and bring him to justice. This expeditionary force was never successful and actually exchanged fire with the Mexican federal troops at one point. They did not have the permission of Mexico to enter, as the Mexicans were happy to be pursuing Pancho Villa on their own. So it was an aggressive act, but one meant to punish those responsible for a terror attack on U.S. soil. In 2001, the US similarly invaded Afghanistan without the Taliban government's permission to similarly root out Al Qaeda terrorists who were responsible for the 9/11 terror attack. The difference between the two is that the Taliban were intentionally supporting Al Qaeda, while the Mexican government was trying to stop Pancho Villa. So, okay, that was a lot to tie together. I wanted you to see themes of both support for and opposition to imperialism in the United States uh, around the turn of the last century. So, out of the American imperialist experience in Haiti in particular, the U.S. carried out some terrible, underreported crimes, but also helped to galvanize a movement among African Americans that would eventually lead, and that African American movement, of course, spread to progressive people across the United States that would lead to Pan-African movements, anti-colonial movements globally that would result in the liberation of hundreds of millions of colonized people all over the world. Absolutely amazing. One of Bill Clinton's talking points comes to mind that there is nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America. That by no means excuses the horrors inflicted on Haiti, nor does it exculpate the US government from the need to make right those wrongs of this imperialist period, but it can help us to have hope as we consider the inspiring parts of American history right alongside the disgusting parts. Okay, enjoy some of these bonus questions and good luck with your papers. Please reach out to me if you have any questions.